What is going on, guys? Vanity here, back with volume 22 of the In the Style of series, this time reverse engineering the sound of Galimatias. This is the composition I'm going to be taking you through today. The chapter times for each segment are, as always, in the pinned comment below. I try to base this composition around the Urban Flora EP by Elena Barras and Galimatias, as this is his most well-known piece of work and it's also his only complete EP or album, which allowed me to really dive in and analyse his sound. Single songs are great, but they don't really allow for the same level of escapism that albums do. Because my own composition doesn't have a vocalist present, I've left a big space for the vocals, and I will of course show you how I've done this throughout this tutorial. I will also be releasing a separate video covering vocal processing, as it's been a very highly requested topic. The first aspect I'd like to dive into in this composition is the musical elements. Here's what they sound like all together. I've got a few different things going on in here. Firstly, there's a rose patch in the centre of the mix, two different acoustic guitar patches, one pan left and one pan right, and an electric guitar patch that's playing the melody. All other sounds are coming from Atmosphere 2 as well. I'll play everything separately, just so you can hear each patch and where it's sitting inside the mix. We'll start with the rhodes. Here's both of the acoustic guitars together. And then the electric guitar. Galimatias incorporates a ton of real-world instruments into his music, including, but not limited to, grand pianos, rhodes, and guitars. He combines these with these soft, elegant synthesizer patches, vocal ambiances, and then of course the dreamy vocals from Elena Barras. I really wanted to embody the use of acoustic instruments in this composition, as it's something that isn't covered enough on YouTube, but it's also the foundation to the sound of Galimatias. There are special considerations that are important when digitally creating or trying to replicate the sound of an acoustic instrument to make it sound genuine. You can't compose a guitar melody on a MIDI keyboard and expect it to sound real. It's a completely different instrument that's played in a completely different way. A pianist and a guitarist are separate abilities. You can't learn one and play both instruments. Just to be clear, you can of course compose a guitar melody on a MIDI keyboard, but special considerations need to be made. I'm not saying either that I've nailed it in this demo composition. There's always going to be room for improvement, but there are a few tips I would like to mention. This tip is replicated across the guitar parts in this track too, but I'll explain it in the context of the rhodes. It's the quantization settings of your chords, or perhaps the lack thereof. If I zoom in on this chord notation, you can see how every note is very slightly offbeat with one another. It's called humanization, and it's done to emulate how a real pianist will strike the keys. Think about it. Not every key will be struck at exactly the same time. Now, obviously it's only milliseconds between the notes, but if you quantize each chord, it does sound very different as opposed to using this method. Again, as I've just mentioned, the guitars follow the same suit. Just to be clear, my goal with the Rhodes and guitars were not to trick the listener into believing that they are real, as only trained ears would notice the difference anyway, but more so to ensure that the dynamics had room to breathe and nothing sounded digitally perfect. Rather than having everything super tight and controlled, I wanted it to be more loose and relaxed but still sound clean and well mixed. Galimatias really seems to nail this paradox in his own productions. Elena Baraz's voice is the focus point, as are any vocals in a track, but you can't help but listen to Galimatias' flawless production either. I really think that this is pretty rare and shows how talented he is as a creative and how well the duo work together. I mentioned towards the beginning of this tutorial that I'd left space for the vocalists to come in and do their own thing. I've done this by first applying a tremolo effect to the Rhodes that are in the centre of the mix. Omnisphere calls it an imager, but in this instance it's the same effect. It's just sweeping the chords back and forth across the left and right channels of this mix. This is great for a couple of different reasons. Firstly, it adds more interest into the track, having an instrument constantly in motion sweeping around the stereo spectrum, rather than being static and only occupying one space. Secondly, it could be set up to actually move around, or even with the vocals. I've then got two slightly different acoustic guitar patches, again from Omnisphere 2, one pan 25 to the right and the other 25 to the left. Just a quick reminder of how they sound. There are definitely frequencies present in this instrument that can mask or interfere with the vocalist's performance. The panning was done to push both guitars slightly out of the centre of the mix, allowing some room for a vocalist to come in and do their thing. When working with an artist or writing an instrumental, you really have got to consider them in the mixing process. If I were to send a track to a friend of mine to write to, but there's no space for her in the mix, she's going to have a much harder job fitting herself into the track. Most vocalists will just play the track on repeat, coming up with ideas as they go, so make sure you bear them in mind. Finally, the last musical element is the electric guitar playing the melody. Again, just a quick reminder. I wanted to go for something that had a gliding element to it, something smooth that could just sit under the vocal without drawing too much attention to itself. I've pushed it back in the mix using bags of reverb and this delay plugin. Yes, I know it's not a stock Ableton plugin, but the same effect just couldn't be achieved with Ableton's delay options. But as you'll hear in just a second, this plugin isn't actually delaying the melody. I'll play you the melody again with the plugin engaged and then bypassed every bar or so. It's definitely washing out the sound, removing most of the high end and applying more of an echo than a delay, as the name suggests. I'm not leaving you empty-handed though. I've linked an article below that contains 17 free delay plugins for both Mac and Windows. I'd recommend the Valhalla delay in that list. Also, make sure you check out their free reverb plugins too. The group bus processing on the music bus looks like this. Starting with an EQ, rolling off everything under 100 Hz, and then taking a dip out around 500 Hz just to remove some of the muddy frequencies present in all of the sounds. The glue compressor is a must to control the dynamics of all the instruments contained within this group track. The acoustic guitar chords are actually moving the needle the most, taking off around 4 dB at its maximum. The next two compressors are sidechaining the kick and snare drum to this music bus, just to give them a bit of extra space in this mix. I've also got some extra tips to share on cleaning up your mixes when I speak about the mastering. You'll see why a little later. But for now, I'd like to jump into the drums, then speak about the bass before I get into the mastering. Altogether, the drums sound like this, soloed. We've got a really simple rhythm with the percussion pulled back to again allow some space for a vocalist. The kick is solid, sitting in the bottom end of the frequency spectrum. It sounds like this, soloed. There's no individual processing on the drums either. I've got just one equalizer on the group bus, which I'll get to in just a second. Galimatias usually has his kick drums sitting pretty loud in the mix, definitely a lot louder than the snare drums, but because of the mid to high frequencies present in the snare, they both sound even and flat. The snare in this track is very quiet actually, around 12 decibels below the kick, but it doesn't actually sound that way, they sound even. Another reason I've pulled back the snare is again to leave space for the vocalist. Snares, especially rim shots, just cut through absolutely everything in a mix, and in this instance I want it to be sitting behind the vocal and not draw any attention away from it. Here's how it sounds soloed. That reverb you're hearing is a spring reverb. I've noticed in a few of Galimatias' tracks that he uses this. It's pretty much all over reggae music. I'm guessing you've all heard it before at some point. I'm using the Compilation Reverb Pro on a return channel with the send turn up to around the 3 o'clock position. This reverb is part of the Max for Live Essentials bundle, which actually comes with Ableton I believe. Perhaps limited to the Suite version only. You can grab it as a separate download though from the Ableton website. The percussion, as I said a little earlier, is fairly minimal and it's pretty quiet too. It's there to provide some groove to the drums, as without percussion the kick and snare will just sound super stagnant with no movement and nothing to tie them together. Altogether, the percussion sounds like this. As I said, there is no processing on the drums at all, besides this EQ on the group channel. Usually I would pair this with Ableton's glue compressor, but because the kick drum was so much louder than the snare drum, it was just reducing the kick too much for me. I also don't actually think that these drums need any compression either. I want to give them space without reducing their dynamic range too much. The EQ is rolling everything off under 50 Hz to remove anything that low from interfering with the sub bass in this track. It's good practice just to tidy up your low end on every group bus, as many people do actually forget it. The two dips at 250 Hz and the other one at 500 Hz are there just to clean up the overall sound of the drums. Any multiples of 500 Hz can contain mud, or are more likely to than other frequencies I've found. This is more of an estimate, but it allows me to go in and make quick adjustments on the fly to remove something I may be hearing. Each sound is different though of course, and will require different EQing to suit, but 500 Hz is commonly referred to as where the mud in sounds resides. All other drums you just heard, as well as a couple hundred more, are from my Galimatias sample pack, available now on Samples by Vanity. Side note too, for anyone who chooses to support what I do over on Patreon, I've actually set up a package where for $20 a month, you can pick any 2 out of the 4 sample packs released every month. So they're basically half price if you choose to support this channel on a monthly basis. All 4 Ableton projects can also be included. Okay, that's it for the drums. Moving on to the bass, which sounds like this, soloed. The bass is made up from 2 parts, a sine wave sub bass coming from Serum and a double bass coming from Omnisphere 2. Why the double bass? I just felt like a sine wave sub bass was a little boring for a Galimatias inspired track. I've not heard this instrument in his tracks, but I definitely think it brings more character to the track than just a plain sine wave. Referring back to the beginning of this tutorial when I spoke on how Galimatias brings in a lot of acoustic instruments into his tracks, bringing it in the double bass was because of this. Everything in this track is a recording of a real world acoustic instrument that's been sequenced in a sampler into what you're hearing. Even the drums, minus the sub bass. Or perhaps not actually, because every sound is actually made up from sine waves at different frequencies, amplitudes and lengths. I have rolled the low end out, everything below 100 Hz, just from the double bass, to allow the sub bass some room in the mix. The group processing on the channel looks like this. The EQ is again taking out some of the muddy frequencies around 500 Hz and applying a high pass roll off at 30 Hz. I've also found compression to be a critical element in order to achieve that full, solid bass sound. Your bass has to be well controlled, otherwise the whole track falls apart. In this instance, I'm taking off between 3 to 4 decibels of gain reduction pretty much the entire time, and then adjusting this makeup gain to add back in some of the volume lost from the compression. The last compressor here is just side chaining the kick drum to the bass line, just giving the kick a little extra space in this mix. The only other sound I have in here is a rain effect, which sounds like this. I have noticed a few field recordings in the background of Galimatias' records just to add an extra layer of texture. Because of how he chooses to mix his records, layering sounds in the foreground as well as the background adds a certain level of depth to his tracks that I just don't hear all that often. Just some food for thought when mixing your own records. Alright, moving on to the last segment in this tutorial, the mastering chain. I've got two mastering chain examples on here, one with stock Ableton plugins and the other with third party. I'll go through the chain in just a second, but earlier in this tutorial I mentioned a mixing tip that I wanted to speak about in the mastering chapter, and it's soloing out the mid and side information of your track separately. I'll just quickly play both the sides and middle of this track so you can hear what I'm talking about. So firstly, the middle. And the sides. You don't need this plugin to do this either. I've linked below a free plugin that allows you to listen to each independently. The reason I believe it's important to listen to the mids and the sides separately is because you can actually hear the instruments present in each and allow you to apply equalization accordingly. I've got 3 quickfire tips for you to try out when you're next mixing a track. The first one is, if a mix sounds muddy, try reducing the low frequencies in the side channel with a low shelf filter. This might be useful, for instance, to surgically EQ the mud out of hard pan guitars while preserving the vocal and kick drum in the center of the mix. Now, you guys will see me do this all the time. I always roll out everything under 250 Hz from the side of the record. The second tip I've got is, if the mastering compressor is struggling to reduce the dynamic range without a perceived narrowing or squashing of the signal, use a mid-side compressor to apply less compression to the side channel than the mid channel. Heavy energy in the center of the mix, where the kick, snare and bass will sit, can cause a compressor to kick in, which actually squashes the wider and more ambient and spatial elements in the mix. This technique helps avoid that problem. The last one I've got is that a dry acoustic mix can be warmed up with mid-side reverb. Add reverb to the mid channel, but filter out some of the low end on the wet reverb signal to avoid muddying the kick drum and the bass. On the side channel, add 2 to 4% more reverb than on the mid channel with no filtering necessary. Back to the mastering chain. I always keep the stock plugin chain limited to just 3 plugins. Starting with an EQ, I'm rolling off around 250 Hz and boosting at 12 kHz on the sides of the track. The boost at 11 kHz is for that air sound, which actually can sound incredible on vocals, especially female vocals, if gotten just right. I'm removing everything under 250 Hz on the sides of the track, which again, I've just mentioned why on the first quickfire tip. I've then got the glue compressor, with which I'm aiming for around 2 to 3 decibels max of gain reduction at any given time. This is also set on the low 2:1 ratio setting. Following that, we've got Ableton's limiter. Again, I'll aim for around a maximum of 3 decibels of gain reduction here too. Now, on this spam plugin here, the RMS for me needs to be around -10 decibels. If it's not, I'll have to go back to the mix and keep tweaking till I can get it to that -10 without taking off more than -3 decibels on the limiter. I'll always leave 0.2 decibels of headroom for any intersample peaks on the limiter too. Again, just a side note, I wouldn't recommend mastering with just Ableton plugins unless it's only for personal use. I would never use them for any client or professional work. This is purely just for demonstrational purposes. Alright, that's all I've got for you today, guys. As always, thank you for watching, and remember to keep sharing your suggestions for future tutorials in the comments section below. I'll talk to you guys in the next one. I'm out. Peace.